What's going on, everybody? This is Aaron Harris, host of the Football Odyssey podcast. And I have with me today a football fan that was born in Chicago, later moved to Charlotte, now lives in Atlanta, but his allegiance lies with the Green Bay Packers. His name is Benjamin Ball. What's going on, Ben?
How you doing, buddy?
Doing well, man. How are you?
Just trying to make it through life. Just, trying not to get incredibly depressed with everything that's going on in the world.
Well, it would be a good time to have football, but even that's in question.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to ask you. Like, do you think it's actually, if you give it a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think what's your positive, what's your optimism or your confidence level in football actually happening this year?
I'm confident they'll start it. I'm not confident they're going to finish it.
Yeah, I think there's going to be like a 2 to 4 week pause at some point. And I think that the month of February gets heavily used because it's just that they own the entire month.
So you think they'll actually pick up the season even if it does get stopped?
Yeah, I think there's too much money on the line. I think there's too much. I think the Super Bowl brings them too much revenue. I think that just the TV contracts themselves, and then on top of that, I think the TV networks are going to be incredibly motivated to make it happen as well. So I think there's going to be too many hands in the. I don't think there's fans in the stands. I don't think there's fans in the stands at all during the season. It may be at like very minimal capacity.
Now, would that bother you at all? Because there's some people who really can't fathom watching football without fans and without the crowd noise. And I know the network said they would inject crowd noise into the broadcast, but I know a lot of people too that also don't even watch the game with the sound on. So for you, would it have any difference the way you view the game?
Not really. I mean, it's like if you imagine it, say you get all 16 games for your favorite team, half of those games you're not even going to hear your crowd noise because you're playing in opposing stadiums. So like if you're winning, you're not even going to be hearing much crowd noise because the home crowd is not going to be wanting to hear your team winning. So I mean, I've been watching the NBA, I've been watching the NHL since they restarted this week, and it's actually been fine. Like you can't really, I mean, the crowd noise is like minimal, and it's kind of nice to hear, but you don't really pay attention to it, right? So like unless it's like a team that you're heavily involved with, like me with the Packers, and I'm watching every second of it. If it's on just in the background, like for me, it's most NFL games, I won't really notice. And like you said, you'll have it on mute or something.
Yeah, well, and for me, I'm kind of somewhere in between because, there are some broadcasters I really enjoy listening to. But for me, like when I'm really invested in a game, I love turning the music up louder and louder as the game gets more exciting. But I guess ultimately it's not going to bear any difference in the way I watch. I just want some sort of football. And college football, I'm really skeptical if that's going to happen. NFL, you don't think so at all?
Yeah, I don't think college football is happening. I can't see it because you're basically saying that the students' lives don't really matter. I mean, you basically kind of have said that for decades, but you're telling me that you're going to trust college students to not spread the disease at frat parties and bars and everything that's happening. I mean, it's just too risky. And you can't have the football players on campus alone because that completely ruins the entire model of these guys are students first, not athletes first, and they're all amateurs. So I can't see them being only the ones on campus, and it's impossible. I just can't see it. I just unless they're bubbling it up, even the conference play that they're doing, I just can't see it happening right now. Unless something like dramatically shifts, unless like the caseloads start going down and there's more treatments that come online in the next couple of weeks, I just can't see it happening. Which sucks, but.
Well, I can't speak for too many of the conferences, but I saw the Pac-12 is only scheduling in-conference games.
What did you see today? Did you see the thing that came out this morning?
No.
I guess like there was an article that was put out in the Players Tribune that basically said that all the Pac-12 athletes have basically come out and said, at this current state, we are not playing. We will all opt out unless you guys do something drastically different to provide us safety. They all basically came out and said we are not playing. And I don't know if that was just one sport, but it seemed like it was all of football players at least. So it's kind of wild.
Yeah, this is definitely going to gain more traction, especially as the season goes along, because even if you do have a fair amount of people that do start the season playing, obviously you're going to have people that are going to get sick, but then you're going to have people who are just going to get frightened when they see someone else get sick and say, okay, that's all I need. I mean, even in the NFL, we see a lot of people opting out already. And I don't know. I don't know who the biggest name is to opt out yet. I mean, I see for like the Patriots, Patrick Chung opted out. And you have more people coming in saying that they're not going to play. But it's going to be interesting to see also too how teams are going to be able to fill the voids of these players who are essential to their team.
Yeah, it's. I think in college it just totally takes one player. I think it literally will just be one player, and then it will be like the NBA where they shut it down, unless they're going to push forward like they have in Major League Baseball, where they're just like, okay, we're going to quarantine this entire team, and everybody else is just going to keep playing, and we'll just shift it. Maybe they do that, but I guess it depends. It depends on which state you're in. I think it depends on, depends on the caseload because certain states are just not being hit as much as the other ones right now. In certain states are recovering after the most recent spikes. So it'll be interesting to see what, I'm sure some universities will just be like, all right, we're just gonna play with it. We're just like, this is a reality, and we're just gonna continue playing with it. And then some others are probably just gonna be like, no, we're not doing it. We're not even gonna risk it. It's not worth it. So there's gonna be a huge financial toll to a lot of universities because of it too, which is gonna suck.
Now, do you find yourself in this time where we don't have sports? Are you finding yourself watching a lot of the old reruns they have on television?
A little bit. It depends. It depends on if it's like an interesting game. Like I know that they've replayed some old golf tournaments and they've replayed some old football games and basketball games, but I found myself just binging like sports documentaries instead. Right. So like, of course, I've rewatched The Last Dance like 7 times. There were some other things that came out, and there was just some old documentaries that I was rewatching, like some old 30 for 30s. But most of my time's been gobbled up by video games and Netflix. So I haven't really gotten caught up too much in like the old reruns. You kind of already know the outcome, and I'm just not going to get really interested unless it's like an old Kentucky basketball game or an old Packer game. I'm not going to really care if it's like an old like Super Bowl from like 2006. I'm just not going to get super interested in it.
Yeah, see, for me, I'm the opposite, man, because as is, during the off season, I typically watch a lot of the old games they have on YouTube because YouTube just has thousands of them. And then, like, when you're saying, Fox Sports is playing, the Super Bowl from like 1999, I'm going to check it out just to watch it because really, I mean, this is an entire business model that, ESPN Classics was built off, and then it quickly devolved into something that was just kind of like a second run for, certain conference games for college football. But I mean, it's something that's been enjoyable for the time being. But I don't think the casual fan is really going to tolerate it for much longer.
Yeah, I think I did see they showed the what was the Seattle Packer game with the whole replacement ref. I rewatched that a little bit. It was really
the Fail Mary game.
God, I hated that game so much. I remember screaming at my TV. I'm like, this is such BS, and I was screaming at the top of my lungs. And my roommate was getting really frustrated with me when it was happening. But yeah, I remember seeing that on ESPN one night, and I rewatched a little bit of it. But then it started getting closer and closer to the end. I'm like, I gotta turn this off. I can't redo it. I can't revisit this. I'm not that much of a masochist. I can't put myself through that much pain. And it's just like rehearing. I think I turned on ESPN at the end of it, and it showed like Russell Wilson being like hugged. And I'm like, all right, yep, that's what I thought. I can't do it.
Yeah, there are some wounds that just never heal, period. I mean, and that's what's great about sports, that you have this instance where you think it's in the moment, and there are some events you move past as you get older, but there are some where you just watch and you can't get over it because I think that was the first game where the Seahawks really became the Seahawks. And then the trouble that the Packers would have with them, too, moving forward, you kind of see like a little bit of a legacy there.
Yeah, and there's always like I think there was like a thing that happened last year. There's like no games played in Seattle or normal games. Like if there's ever a weird game in the NFL that happens over the last decade, Seattle is somehow involved in it. And it just so happens that like the Packers are involved in 3 or 4 of those games, and like 2 of them caused me immense pain, especially the one that was in the NFC Championship game where they're up by like 20 points and then just like the slow, just absolute collapse. And it was just such a weird collapse. So it's just like, every time they play in Seattle, I cringe. It's something strange is going to happen. And they're going to lose, and it's going to be in the stupidest and most painful way. And it was just like that one specifically, and it was just like, oh my God, like how could you mess this up so bad? And they were like reffing with like JUCO refs. I mean, it was just such a catastrophe.
I remember, I don't think it was this game, but I remember that in the first or second week, there was a replacement ref who was officiating a New Orleans Saints game, and there was a picture that came out of him over the weekend wearing a Saints shirt from the day before he was going to be refereeing the game, and you're just thinking, yeah, this is not going to work out for much longer.
It's just like it was so poorly done, and like you could so tell that the NFL, like the league was on such a bad footing because the games just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I think that one was like the Picto de Resistance or whatever that saying is. Like that was like the pinnacle of it. It was on Monday night. It was on Monday Night Television or Monday Night Football. It was two massively popular teams, and it was a good game, and it just happened to be a Fail Mary, whereas like the receiver caught the cornerback who was catching the football, and they gave it to the cornerback. No, I gave it to the receiver. I'm like, what? No, no. And it was just like everything couldn't have gone worse for the league as far as like it played perfectly into the referees on their side of the what was it? It was a strike, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so just everything played in so well for them. They're like, yeah, you actually do need us. You guys actually do think we're bad at our jobs? No, we're actually pretty good. We're actually like the best that you can get. It's like it could get a lot worse if you guys don't have us, and that's basically what it showed.
Absolutely. So before we go deeper into the NFL and Packers football, let's rewind a little bit and tell us how you got into football to begin with, and how old were you? Was this something that your parents kind of brought you up with, or did you take to it just by yourself?
It was something. I mean, our family is incredibly divided as far as like my dad. So not saying they're divided. My mom's side, like all of them are all Packer fans. Like there's usually like one team on each side that almost the entire side roots for. As far as all the other chaos that happens in a big family. So my mom's side all live in Wisconsin, outside of maybe some stragglers that live in like Florida and live in Tennessee. But the majority of my mom's family lives in Wisconsin. So they're all going to be either Badger fans or Packer fans. And then my dad's side are all Kentucky basketball fans. My dad's side, because they all live in Kentucky, there's no NFL team. So the NFL is not a huge, they're more college football. So as far as the NFL, I had two choices: either be a Bears fan, where they were bad, they were not good, or be with my mom's side and just be a Packer fan, where Brett Favre was the best player in the league and he's my favorite athlete of all time. So it was just kind of easy to choose them. And then growing up, like I wasn't like a massive football fan growing up, like in the early years, just because basketball was such a prevalence in my life, playing it and then following it. But it was roughly around 1999, 2000 was when I got really into it. And it was where Brett Favre really was getting really good. And I can remember watching the Titans St. Louis Rams football game of the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching in my parents' bedroom. We had a big Super Bowl party, and I was watching in my parents' bedroom alone. And I was watching, I don't know who it was, whoever the receiver was, stretching his arm out and just not getting it across at the end of the game. I was a big Eddie George fan too, so that was like that was when I got really into it. And I had like an Eddie George jersey, even though I still had a bunch of Packers stuff. So it was really around 1999, 2000, where I was like 8 years old. That's when I got really into it.
Did you play at all?
No, yeah, I played 1 year. Freshman year of high school, I was 90 pounds. I was 5'2", 90 pounds. Whereas I mean, I'm 6'2", 220 right now, so it's a little bit different. But I was tiny. I was a receiver, and I just got my clock run almost every play in the field. I went to a small school, so like I was on both JV and varsity, and I shouldn't have been on either. It was just they put me at. I remember they put me on return, and they put me on kickoff too. So when I was I remember like when they kicked the ball off, and I was chasing down the field, and there's just a guy who was like 100 pounds heavier than me, just like stuck his arm out and clocked me, and I just got the wind knocked out of me, and then I threw up. And I was like, at that point, I'm like, yeah, this is gonna be a 1 year thing. I'm gonna go back to basketball. Like I played park football a lot with some friends when I was a kid. And we played tackle, and we would play in our park in our neighborhood. But that was like the most experience I had going into that 1 year of high school football. And then that was it. I never played football again. I was just like, yeah, I'm gonna stick to basketball. I'm gonna stick to basketball, golf, hockey, and some other stuff. But I can't do football. I can't. That was just too much.
Yeah, it definitely takes a certain attitude to play football and a certain perseverance, because it's one of those sports where I don't think you can really pick up, fluidly, because, and maybe no sport you can, but it's definitely a specialized sport where you actually might be misplaced at a position when you should be playing something else.
Yeah, and it takes so much. Like I remember when I first started, it was summer. It was summer going into freshman year, and we had to go up for 3 days up into the mountains in North Carolina. We had like the school like booked out this retreat, and we were practicing 3 times a day in the summer in North Carolina. So it's 100 degrees, extremely humid, And I just remember there wasn't like, and you're sharing like a dorm room with another guy, and you're just in there you're just 3 practices. There wasn't really any off time, and there really wasn't much to do in the off time because there was this weird retreat where there was no internet or TV, so you were just kind of hanging around everyone, and I do. I'll turn that off. Yeah, it should be turning off.
Sorry, but
so yeah,
Ben is turning his television off, everybody. Well,
sorry about that.
Go ahead.
There was background noise. Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, so it was just, you're stuck in the mountains. There's not a lot to do. And then on top of that, you're sweating in this practice stuff. And then you're hanging this practice stuff up in the dorm room in which you're staying in. And there really wasn't many times that you could wash it because you're there for a week and you'd have to wash it only every 2 or 3 days. So the shit would just smell. It was like the most putrid smell you could think of. And so that was like my first ever experience with football, was just this 3 days. And it was horrible. And then, going into JV season, it was just, I was so underweight. I was not good. I was playing receiver and I was playing DB and I couldn't catch the ball for dear life. And then we had 2 quarterbacks. We had a guy named Evan Arthur and we had a guy named Keith Neville. And Keith he was a baseball player. So he could just dart the ball. I mean, he could throw the ball like Patrick Mahomes. I mean, the ball would come in. It would come in so hot. You couldn't catch it. And then Evan would come in and he was a little bit more, he had a much softer touch. So and they would switch on offense as far as playing QB. So one game you'd had Evan throwing you the ball and it'd be a lot easier to catch. But then Keith would come in and he'd run a slant and he'd dart the ball in. I couldn't catch it. I didn't know. And I was also playing with baseball gloves for like half the season because I didn't know what to buy. And so me and my dad went to like Dick's Sporting Goods and we bought baseball gloves and I didn't know they weren't football gloves. I didn't know they weren't receiver gloves. So like halfway through the season, the kid on the team gave me his old gloves. And I'm like, I couldn't believe I wasn't playing with these the entire time. And I also bought cleats. So the cleats I bought weren't receiver cleats. They were lineman cleats. So they were a lot heavier and they were a lot higher up on your legs. So like they were weighing me down almost the entire time. So I was a lot slower. But I remember when the season ended, I went into basketball and because I'd been basically playing with like these 10-pound weights on my legs, I was a lot faster. It actually was kind of great. I remember playing basketball with a buddy of mine and we were running up and down the court doing sprints and doing 25s or suicides or whatever we were doing. And I was a lot faster than I was the year before because I was just wearing these like weighted cleats on for all of football season. So it was kind of nice, but it was just, I went in so ill prepared and I was just running around with like the wrong equipment on. It was such a bad experience.
Now, when you did get into football, what was it in particular about the sport that really drew you in? Was it something that, I guess, the tradition of it? Was it more of the way the game was played, how physical it was, or the strategy, players? What was it that really kind of drew you in?
As far as playing it, or as far as watching it?
Watching it.
It had to be Brett Favre. I mean, it had to be. I love athletes. I love the ones that just they have fun with it and they're goofballs and they're also just playing their heart out and they're gonna play in both. He throws an interception, he's gonna figure out a way to tackle the guy that he threw the interception to, or he's gonna figure out a way, if he hands the ball off, he's gonna be out front blocking for his running back. And it was just so much fun to watch a guy just have a time of his life playing the game. And if he made a mistake, he didn't care. And it was just such an enjoyable thing. So that was really what drew me in, was Brett Favre. And then as I got older, I got more into college football as well. And it was just like, I think the first year I really watched college football was 2014 or whenever Ohio State won the national championship. And when they first did the college football playoffs in 2014-15, I had gone to an Ohio State football game. It was my real first college football experience. And granted, this is 10 years after I really started watching the NFL. It was 12, 13 years after I first started watching the NFL. And we went to an Ohio State game when they played Rutgers, and they won 59-0. And they were incredible. It was such a great experience. And then just being around that atmosphere of a real college football, like tailgate, going to the game, being in the horseshoe with 100,000 people. And it was just such a cool thing to see. I'd gone to Lambeau, and that's a whole nother experience. But seeing the first real college football stadium, because I went to college football games when I was in college, but I went to a small D1 school, so we didn't really have that many great, tailgates, and we couldn't drink. You couldn't do any of that stuff on campus, so it wasn't the same. So going to this horseshoe, it's different. It's such a cool thing.
Now talk to me being a Packers fan in Chicago, because you were living there until you were 12, you said?
Yeah.
So
So
what was that like? Were you just ridiculed day in and day out, or is there actually more Packers fans there that you can identify with that people and maybe not know about?
so where I lived in Chicago, we lived about an hour north of the city. We were on the outskirts in the suburbs, but we there was a lot of commuters that would go into the city from where I lived, just because it was so much cheaper to live out there. But I think I was too young to realize that there was much ridicule. I know my mom got a bunch of bunch of shit from all of our neighbors, but we had two neighbors on our street, and we were really close with almost every person that lived on our street. We had about 15 houses on our street that we had block parties almost once a month during the summers, and so everybody knew each other. But there was about two other families that were huge Packer fans, bigger ones than we were. I mean, their garages were decked out. They had almost everything you can think of. They had like 25 cheeseheads, like hats that you can that like in all different shapes. Like they had like cowboy ones. They had like the normal block of cheese ones. They had fedoras, everything you can think of. So we would watch the games with them, and I could never remember. I know my dad would talk a little crap, but I never really remembered. It wasn't until I got to North Carolina when I got to the I got a lot of trash talk thrown my way, which is weird because the Panthers had only been around for 10, 15 years, and they had been in the Super Bowl once. So when I got into it was about high school when I first started getting a lot of it. It was from friends who, the Panthers been in the Super Bowl in 2005, and then they were just mediocre the rest of the time.
Yeah,
So
2003.
yeah, 10-3, that was it. But it was just so funny because they weren't historically good, and we were in the playoffs every other year. So it's just like, why are you guys talking all this smack if you guys aren't good? And it was just like, when was the last time you won a Super Bowl? Oh, we never won. Okay, then why are you talking shit? Why are you bringing this up? Why are you trying to get in my head? And then the Packers would play the Panthers almost every other year, and it would always be in Carolina. So I mean, there was always that. But it was always from Panther fans that I would get the most like talk like crap talking from. And it was just like it was so weird.
Now, where did you go to college in North Carolina?
I went to Gardner Webb, small Baptist school right outside of Charlotte, which is about an hour outside the city.
And you had a football team?
Somewhat, yes.
So describe to me what it's like. Was it D1 AA or was it D1
Yeah,
school?
it was
So,
D1 2A. So guys,
so talk to me about the atmosphere, because I know you said you didn't really have like a lot of tailgates or anything like that. But do you think there's any sort of, I guess, advantage or intimacy you get with the team that maybe you don't really get at a big university?
maybe we just didn't have it. If you went to a different school, if you went to like App State, where
Mm-hmm.
they were also D1 2A at the time, they were really good. They were winning champion. I think they have like the most amount of national championships in the D1 2A division or in that league, in that level. They had the most, and they were winning them almost every year at that time. And they have so basically the way our football stadium was set up was like you had one side that looked like a high school football stadium, and then the other side looked like a somewhat decent sized football stadium. So it was only two sides. It wasn't like a full bowl. It was just two sides that you had stands on, and one side was just really small. And they were actually the old state. It was actually the old side from it was the old home side from like the 1960s, and they didn't do anything to renovate it. And then on the other side, they just built this like brand new, like massive stand, like massive section. And so we would go to the games. There was no alcohol because we were in a dry town. So there's no alcohol sold within the town. There was no drinking on campus. So the tailgates were different. My first 2 years, I would go as a student, and we had a small student section, and it was fine. But our team was really boring. Our team was running like a wishbone offense, and they would just hand it off every 5 seconds. It was just so
Retro.
boring. Yeah, and I remember one game. It was the first game I ever went to. They played Sam Houston State, and I think we got beat by like 35. It was horrible, and I was like, "Yeah, this is great. This is such a great experience." We were never good. And then my last 2 years, because I was with the basketball team, we would have tailgates. And those were a little bit better because we would bring in TVs and we would have recruits on campus, and we would have, we'd have takeout, and we'd have Bojangles come catered in, and we would have TV set up to watch other games while we were waiting for our football game to start. And then once our football game started, we would stay for like the first half, and then we would bowl. So college football was never a big deal at Gardner Webb. A lot of our students were big USC fans or big like South Carolina fans or Clemson fans because of the proximity to those campuses. And so like a lot of people, they were going to go to like a real college football game, they would go to Clemson, they would go to South Carolina, just because they're like an hour drive away.
Now, how did you said it was 2014 when you went to the Ohio State game?
Yeah, whenever, like I said, whenever they won that championship, I think it was 2014, 2015.
Now, how did you get to go see them in person?
So I had a buddy who was from Ohio, and a lot of his friends went to Ohio State, and he was at Gardner Webb with me. And I remember they went the year before, and he was it was a year prior, and he went with another buddy of ours, and they just drove up for the weekend, and they were just like, "We're gonna go up, we're gonna go to a frat party, we're gonna go to football game." And then the following year, he invited me too, and so we drove up on a Friday or Thursday or Friday. We spent the night in like this old college house with a bunch of other guys, and I remember we had a party the Friday night. It was great. It was such a good party compared to the ones that we had at Gardner Webb. And then the next day we tailgated. We went to the game. It was when JT Barrett was the starting quarterback. It was when Ezekiel Elliott was there. It was when Michael Thomas was there, and they just ran up the score. I mean, it was so bad. It was like 59-0 somewhat. It was a day game. It was cold. It was rainy. They snuck me in. They got me into the student section, and I had to go buy an Ohio State shirt to. If they asked me if I was a student, I could just be like, if I wore an Ohio State shirt, they wouldn't really ask. They wouldn't think I was from somewhere else. If they had asked because you think you have to have a student ID to get into that section. So luckily, because I was wearing like Ohio State gear, they didn't care, or they just assumed I was a student. And then they had this thing. It was like every time they kicked off the ball, after every score at halftime or whatever, they would go OHIO, rip his effing head off, but they wouldn't say effing. And it was a long standing tradition. Apparently the school had been trying to change it. They've been trying to get fans to stop cheering it. So they would come out and they would try to say, "Oh no, it's, chant this instead," and they would just never work. And then at halftime they had the Ohio State band come out. Oh my God. It's the best marching band in the country, and they have all the different designs that they do and the different formations, and they spell out I think there's a video that you can look up. I think it's from that game where they were playing the Jurassic Park theme, and the entire band from like up high, they formed like a dinosaur, and the dinosaur was like walking across the field in this giant formation of band members. It's incredible. I'm pretty sure that's that game, and you can actually find it on YouTube. You just look up like Ohio State band dinosaur, and you'll probably find the video.
A marching band can really do a lot of good for a football program because if you're bad, they can be kind of the shining light and the source of entertainment. Yeah. And if they're good, they can really get the crowd to go to a whole nother level.
Oh yeah, and they're the best. I mean, you'll see. I mean, I think they're the ones that go viral every single year because they do all these crazy formations and they just get really creative in it. I mean, they always do the I don't know if it's the Ohio national anthem or the state anthem of Ohio, or they just play the themes like the fight song for Ohio State, and they spell out Ohio State in like cursive, and it's like really iconic. It's really cool.
Cool. So while we're on the topic of great atmospheres, you mentioned that you had gone to see a Packers game at Lambeau. Mm-hmm. So how would you describe, let's talk about the city of Green or the town of Green Bay. How would you describe it to someone who hasn't been there before?
It's like you ever watch that 70s show?
No, not really.
Okay. So in that 70s show it's based in a small town in Wisconsin where everybody knows each other. It's almost like that. It's like a massive tailgate too. So like, it's really small. Everybody is nice as can be. It's so different. So like, there's all these. It's literally like, if you imagine if you dropped a football stadium, like 70,000 seat. I think it's 80,000 because they added stuff on. But imagine dropping an 80,000 seat stadium into the middle of a neighborhood, because there's all these little subdivisions across the street from it. And if you drive in, like I went to a game last year, and it reminds you how crazy it is. So there's houses that back up against the stadium, and those houses have been converted into like just Packers paradises. I mean, there's just like all the back of them have like little like guest houses, and they have like beer taps built into the side of the house. They have like, it's perfect for renting it out for the weekend and having a big party. I mean, that's what it is. And that's why the people who own them don't even live in them, because they rent them out during the season to people who come in from out of town or from companies that want to rent them out for parties. And then if you get inside that neighborhood, almost every house rents out their driveway and their yard for parking. So like, there's just like a random little like ranch house, and they're charging $30 for you to park in their driveway. And it's almost every single house is renting out their driveway for parking. And then you get inside the stadium, and everybody's so nice. Everything's cheap, dude. It's not super expensive. So like, I remember I went the day before New Year's Eve last year. So I went on like December 30th. They're playing the Lions, and they're having such a bad season. It wasn't this past year; it was the year prior. It was before Matt LaFleur got there. So it was the last year of Mike McCarthy. and he had already been fired by that game. So I forgot whoever the head assistant was filling in for him, or he was the interim head coach, Joe Philbin. I think that's who it was. And Aaron got hurt in the first quarter, and they got completely routed by the Lions. But it was so fun because it was incredibly cold. I think it was probably 12 degrees. I bought a beer and I sat it down, and I picked it up 5 minutes later, and it started to freeze. I mean, there was little shards of like frozen beer in it that I was swallowing. And everybody around you was really cool. I mean, everybody's like high-fiving you and hugging you if they did something well. Unfortunately, they got completely skunked in that game, so there really wasn't much to celebrate. So everybody was really depressed, and everybody was like really pessimistic for most of the game. But it's really cool, and it's like the entire town is devoted to the team. So it's like everywhere you go is like Brett Favre Lane or Bart Starr Drive or whatever. Everything is named after the Packers or previous Packers. They've added on to it too. They started to kind of build like an entire amusement park for the Packers. I forgot the name of it, but they've basically built like this ice rink, and they built the Hall of Fame, and they've added onto like a hotel and apartments, and it's really cool to see what they've done. They basically turned it into a theme park outside the stadium.
And every time I go to Pittsburgh for a game, and I've been probably 3 or 4 times, I always go, and I think people have this idea that Pittsburgh is a really small town, and I think it's smaller than a lot of other cities that host an NFL team, but you get that same sort of feeling where it's this community that's really invested in this major sports franchise. But with Green Bay, because Green Bay, it sounds like it's about the size of my hometown in Florida, where it's about 100,000 people. And really, the Packers are the sole source of entertainment, or basically the soul of that city. So I can imagine it must be kind of that on steroids.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a large college town, because there is a university there. There is UW Green Bay, and there is like a multiplex arena, I think, that is used by the university. But yeah, the entire thing is devoted. It's a college town. It almost is like basically a college town where the Packers are their college team. Granted, like the UW Badgers are really good, but they're a couple hours south. And Green Bay is so isolated. I mean, I think it's 4.5 hours north of Chicago, and it's about 2 hours north of Milwaukee. So it's so isolated. So if you're going to be in Green Bay, you're most definitely going to be there for a Packers game. That's it. So everything is built around the stadium, and the stadium is almost like in the center of the city, and you can see the stadium from anywhere in the city. You can see it for miles out when you're driving up the highway. You just see it kind of like in the background. It's a whole nother thing. It's a whole nother experience.
Now, what about Lambeau? Is that because I hear people talk about how it's like an old school stadium where they have bleachers and they don't have like seats with like backs on them? Is that true?
Yeah. So it was. I made the mistake of not getting like a lot of people would get the little seat backs that you can buy, and you would just kind of clamp onto the bench, because it's a metal bench that goes all the way around. And the people would buy like the little seat backs so they can sit up against them. But they were mostly like season ticket holders or avid goers who lived in Wisconsin. So I made that rookie mistake. But yeah, it's very uncomfortable. It's very cold because it's metal. And so it's like if you're there in the cold, your butt's going to freeze. And I had a massive parka on that I had bought because I was also up in Chicago that weekend for the Winter Classic. So I was prepared for the outdoor. But it was much worse in Green Bay than it was in South Bend for the Winter Classic, and I was out in South Bend a lot longer than I was in Green Bay. So it's freezing, but it's like it's the oldest stadium in the league, but they've done so many good things to basically renovate it. So they've added on. If you see it, I mean, there's press boxes go around the entire stadium, and then on some cases, I think in the end zones, they've added bleachers onto those. So it's gotten a lot bigger over the decades. So it's a lot bigger than it was. And it's actually one of the biggest stadiums in the league based on sheer capacity. And it don't look like that because the stadium goes out like this and not straight up like this. So yeah, because there's also not designated seats, people just kind of squeeze in too. But everybody, like I said, everybody's super nice, and it depends on where you go. If you go in the fall, it's not that bad. If you go in the winter, you're most likely going to be freezing, and you're most likely your butt's going to be completely numb by the end of the game. It's pretty crazy.
Now, what's something that you think, I mean, obviously what you just said is pretty unique to the Packers because every team has their own little idiosyncrasy, I guess you could call it. What are some other things that you think that only Packers fans would understand that other fans of teams that wouldn't?
I think that I don't know any person that's gone to a Packer game that wasn't a Packer fan that's had a bad experience. That's gotten beer and throw at them or whatever. I've gone to certain games where if you're a fan of the other team, you're going to get cursed out. Like when I lived in Boston, I would I remember going to like some Celtics games, and you just have Boston fans screaming at people that weren't Boston like Celtics fans. And it was even like like I went to a college hockey game, I went to a BU game, and they were playing BC, which is literally across the town, like across towns, like maybe 5 miles away. And it was at BC, and BC fans were so BU fans. They live in the same city, but in Boston, in Green Bay, like you're not going to have a bad experience. You could even be a Bears fan, and you're not going to have a bad experience. You could be a Vikings fan, which I think they say that the Bears rivalry is older and it's more historic, but I think there's much more hatred for Vikings fans than there are for Bears fans from a Green Bay perspective. Like because they're up there with them. I think they're closer to Minnesota. I'm not really entirely sure on the distance, but there's more hatred for Vikings fans than there are for Bears fans, and even that. Like you're not going to meet a Vikings fan that goes to the game in Green Bay and is just getting beer thrown at them or getting shit thrown at them or getting cursed out. They're just going to have a good experience. Like everybody's so nice to each other. It's just so different, and everybody's so welcoming. Like when I was there, I did accidentally walk into one of those houses that was having like a corporate party for a company, and I didn't know what it was. The backyard was open, and I just kind of walked in. I was by myself. And I just grabbed the beer from they literally had a keg built into the side of the house. And I was pouring myself a beer and I was pouring myself chili. And someone goes, "Do you work for this? Do you work for X, like whatever company it was?" I'm like, "No, I just thought this was open." And they're like, "Don't tell anybody." And I'm like, "Okay." And they were just like, okay with me just hanging out for a little bit. And I just had some chili and I had a beer and I left, and no one cared. So everybody's super nice. And I think that's like the big difference. I mean, granted, you can go into like it's being so isolated. So like if you're playing in Atlanta, the opposing team can go out to the strip clubs and go out to the bars. You can't do that in Green Bay. You're going to be in Green Bay. You're not going to have much of a nightlife the night before, the day after. But everybody's so nice and welcoming that I think that's the biggest difference. And I think it does. Like if you are an opposing fan and you're going there for the first time, it probably is weird because everybody is so nice, and you're probably suspicious of why they're so nice because it's so different, and you probably never experienced that before.
Yeah, there's definitely stadiums I would never dream of going to. I mean, the Raiders are leaving Oakland and going to Vegas, but Oakland was never a place I would willingly go. Yeah. Even going to Gillette, if it was a Patriots Steelers game, I would have serious second thoughts, not only because the Patriots have owned the Steelers, but Boston fans are just a whole another type of fan.
They're maniacs. They're just absolute maniacs, and they're just like every time you hear about something going bad in a stadium with fans, it's always Boston somehow. And Boston is somehow involved. Somehow their fans are fighting with each other, or they're fighting with the opposing team fans. I mean, they're just vicious.
Now, do you remember the first Packer game that you went to?
Yeah, I was a kid. And it was in Chicago. I remember it was like probably 1998. It was playing in, I think it was the old Soldier Field. I'm pretty sure it was an old Soldier Field, and my dad went. He got tickets from his company. I don't remember who won. I just remember being really cold, and I was like 6 years old. I don't remember much. That was like my first experience. And then I went to a couple Bears games afterwards, just because we would get tickets from my dad's company, and they would be playing, like the Lions or whatever. But that was probably my first NFL experience with the Packers involved.
What about going to Lambeau?
So the first time I went was after high school. I didn't really go to Lambeau games until after I graduated high school and after I moved to North Carolina, hilariously. We went up there for graduation. I went up there for it was my graduation present. So my parents took us up for the weekend in Chicago, and then we were going up to Wisconsin because I graduated the same year as a cousin of mine. So they did a big duo party for the both of us. And we just happened to, it was like me, my dad, and my grandfather. My grandfather's a massive Packer fan, and so we went up and we did the tour, and we ate at the stadium, and we went to see the Hall of Fame, and you could see the locker room, and you could see the field. And it's such a well done tour. Like it's this really cool part where you get to come out of the same tunnel as the players, and they'll put on like a recording through the speakers of what the actual like announcers will say, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's number 4, Brett Favre," and you can like run out of the tunnel at the same time. It's really cool. So they do a really good job. I mean, that's when they started doing a lot of the improvements and started kind of renovated the Osiris Stadium. They've kept that like allure of Green Bay and Lambeau intact, but they've added a lot of like modern amenities too. It's kind of like a really cool combo.
Cool. Now, speaking of Brett Favre, I don't think it's any secret now that he's your favorite player of all time, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Now, you can't really talk about the Packers without bringing Brett Favre versus Aaron Rodgers. Now, Brett is your favorite player, but would you still argue that he's a better quarterback than Aaron Rodgers, or do you think it's not comparable?
He's more enjoyable. I think Aaron's definitely a better quarterback, but their careers are so similar at this point. I mean, it's weird because they both won one Super Bowl, they both won 3 MVPs.
Well, I think Aaron has 2.
I thought he has 3. All right, whatever. He might have 2. But either way, they both have multiple MVPs and one Super Bowl, and they've won the Super Bowl on early in their careers, and they haven't really done much since. They've gone to the playoffs a bunch of times, and I think Brett went to 2 Super Bowls, but he went to a bunch of NFC Championship games and lost in heartbreaking fashion, just like Aaron Rodgers. And then at the same time, the Green Bay Packer organization, like they did with Brett Favre, they didn't do a lot. They didn't spend a lot of money to provide him with a lot of weapons. On top of that, they kind of like had early exit strategy. Now, granted, Aaron's a little bit different than Brett in the way he's handled it. Aaron said from the beginning that he wants to play until he's 45 and he wants to be with the Packers the entire time. Whereas Brett would, retire and come back, float about retiring, come back. And he was kind of selfish in that way, but I didn't really care. I just liked him. I was always happy to have him back. And even when he left and then he came back and played for the Jets and played for the Vikings, I actually did selfishly root for the Vikings and the Jets those seasons because I was so pissed. I was so mad. I was so upset with the Packers organization for letting him go in the way that they did. And then when the Packers started getting good and Brett finally retired, I went back to the Packers. And now watching what they're doing to Aaron is driving me up a wall because you go 13-3, you have a really young team, you have your quarterback, he's got 4 or 5 years left, and you have this draft full of receivers, and you don't draft a single one, and you trade up and you draft a freaking quarterback who's not even proven to be good. He's not even like one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the draft. So you trade up and you have a chance to get a really good receiver, and you get a quarterback instead, and then you don't even draft a receiver the entire draft. You load up on like halfbacks and tight ends and defensive people. And it was just absolutely, it was the most, I was screaming at my television. I was like, this is the stupidest thing in the world. And then I have to watch like other teams go all out to make sure their teams are going to win a Super Bowl. And I'm watching the Packers. They're like, oh no, we're preparing for the future. And I'm like, no, you're good now. Win now. What are you doing? And it's just, and it's basically, they're doing the same thing to Aaron, what they did to Brett. And it's just absolutely enraging to watch.
Yeah, and it feels like anybody who's under the age of 30 is automatically going to defer to Aaron Rodgers as the better quarterback. And frankly, I think so because Rodgers has less interceptions than Brett ever had, obviously. I mean, the guy just doesn't turn the ball over. But I also find a lot that people really have a sentimental attachment to Brett that they don't have with Aaron. Because I've heard people say too that, if we have a game of 58, the first 58 minutes I want Brett, and then the last 2 minutes I want Aaron.
Well, I would say that I would think based on pure skill, I would probably say Brett's better, but just based on discipline, I think in efficiency, I think Aaron's better because Brett had a better arm. Brett had as good or better wheels early on in his career. It was just the decision making that screwed him over. It was the reckless abandon of I'm just going to launch this ball through two cornerbacks to get it to the receiver. And at some points he would make it, and some points he wouldn't. Aaron's a much better, much more disciplined quarterback. And his touchdown to interception ratio is like 3-1 or 4-1 or something like that. It's like the best in history by like a long shot. And Brett, he's got the most interceptions. And he's the most. To me, like you're a fan of Dan Patrick, like I am. They always compare quarterbacks, like historic quarterbacks, to bands, and there's not a better comparison to compare Brett Favre to Bruce Springsteen, who. He's gonna empty the tank every time he goes out, whether it's good or bad. He's gonna empty the tank, and it was just like all or nothing every single time, and that's why I left him. It was just like he's gonna go balls to the wall like crazy every single game, and he's gonna try to win every game no matter what the relevancy of the game is.
But to go off that, I think also too on the Dan Patrick show, they also asked the question if Aaron Rodgers has made Brett Favre an underrated quarterback. And it's it's thought provoking because usually when a guy's in a Hall of Fame and a 3-time NFL MVP, you're not really going to think of someone like that as underrated. But it seems that when we refer to Brett, it's always we think of his turnovers and his reckless abandon more so than what he did right and the excitement that he brought when he did come through in those clutch moments.
Yeah, and I think it was because Brett played for so long. I mean, he played 2 decades. and he played for 18 or whatever years in Green Bay. I think it might have been 16. I think it was 16 years he played in Green Bay. And he, in like the first 6 or 7 years of his career, or the first 8 years in the 90s, he was so good. I mean, I think he won 3 MVPs back to back, or he won
in a row.
or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was so good. And you can rewatch the clips, and then like later on, like people our age didn't really see him until like the latter half of his career. And he was still good, but his mobility was gone, and he was still reckless, but it wasn't the same. And then, we spent the majority of our years watching Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron was been so good for so long, and he hasn't really lost it at all. I mean, you can make an argument in the last couple of years, just kind of lost it a little bit, but it's 2 decades since Brett was at his best. And I think that's why he's a little underrated, because we don't really remember him like he was. When I think of Brett Favre and I really think about him, I think of the older Brett Favre. Towards the end of his career in Green Bay and the years that he spent in Minnesota.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is that when you talk to people who are our age, we're gonna think of Brett as a good player, but we're always gonna think of him first and foremost as the guy who just couldn't be retired. He was always coming. He was coming out of retirement, 3 years in a row. And with the Jets, I really don't remember his career that well, because I think 2008 was the year where I really got heavily into football, and that's when he was with the Jets. So I didn't really pay too much attention to them. But once 2009 rolled around, with the Vikings, he was putting up crazy numbers.
Oh, yeah, it was his best season ever. It was his first year in the Vikings. There's only one player I remember about his time with the Jets. Outside of the dick pic thing with the trainer, there was one thing I remember. There was a play that he faked, and I remember sitting on my parents' couch. No, it was not my parents' couch. It was my parents' chair in my family room, and he handed the ball off, or he faked the handoff, and he hit his ball. He hit the ball behind his butt, and he was just kind of and everybody was, and the cameras were faked out. Everybody was going with the running back, and the running back went straight. He ran right into the lineman. So you never even saw if he had the ball or not. And then all of a sudden, there's a guy streaking downfield, and there's no one on him. And Brett just pops the ball up behind his butt, and he launches it, and he throws a touchdown. And I remember sitting there, and I was there was a girl I was really into who was also a Packer fan. And she texted me at the same time. She goes, "Oh my God, that fake." And I was like, that was the best play I've ever seen in my life. And that was also the year that he got beat up by Matt Castle for a playoff spot. That was the year I think Tom Brady went down for his season early on in the season. So, that was the only play I really remember from that season for the Jets. And then, when he was with the Vikings, I remember breaking my mom's heart and breaking my family's heart rooting for the Vikings that year whenever they played the Packers. And I would watch every Vikings game because I just wanted to see Brett Favre. And then when he finally, I think it was the next year, he wasn't very good. And I went back to the Packers, but it was heartbreaking. It was so heartbreaking to watch him in that jersey, but he had so many great plays. There was one that they were playing the 49ers, I think, and I can't remember the player that he threw the ball to.
I think it was Sidney Rice.
Was it Sidney Rice? It was either that or
Visanthe Shiancoe. Yeah, that might have been who it was. Yeah.
And he launched it to the very back of the end zone, and the guy.
His time expired.
Yeah, that was a great play. That was awesome, and it was. I remember running around the house after that play because he did this great move where one of the defensive ends was trying to sack him, and he just kind of windmilled him, and then he just launched it, and he launched it across his body to the perfect position. It was just the best play ever.
So while we're on the topic of best plays ever, what are some of your favorite memories as a Packer fan?
There was a season I lived in Charlotte. It was the year the Panthers made the Super Bowl in 2015 or whatever. The Packers weren't that good. They had a lot of injuries. I think it was the year Jordy Nelson went out. So they were just kind of hurt the entire year. Ty Montgomery got moved to a running back, I think, from a receiver. And that pissed me off because he was a really good receiver. But there was 2 or 3 Hail Marys that year from Aaron Rodgers. There's the one against the Lions that I know everybody talks about. There was one against the Lions on Thanksgiving when I had written off that game. I was like, we're going to lose this, and we're not going to make the playoffs. And then he threw that crazy Hail Mary. And then there was the game against the Cardinals where he threw 2 Hail Marys in one game. It was one to get it from the 1 yard line to the 50. And then he threw it from the 50 to the end zone to the same player. And I can't remember the player's name, but he was a white guy from Wisconsin. He was a receiver from Jeff Janis. He threw it to Jeff Janis both times. And it was this crazy game. And I remember watching it at this bar in Charlotte, at this Packer bar. and he threw the first one. I went nuts, and then threw the second one, and I didn't know what to believe. And then they went into overtime, and of course they screwed it up in overtime. So that was one season I had a great time watching. It was the year that they went on the run. I think it might have been the next year. I was living in Boston, and I went to the same bar every single weekend. I went to the same Packer bar in Chelsea in Boston. No, it wasn't in Chelsea. It was in God, it was in a bad neighborhood. It starts with a D. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a Chelsea soccer bar, and on the top level they had a Packer section, and I would go, and they ran off like it was the run the table year where they just won like 7 or 8 games to get into the playoffs, and then they made it to the NFC Championship. It was the year the Patriots beat the Falcons in the Super Bowl. And they got just absolutely just wrecked by the Falcons in the NFC Championship game. So I remember leaving the bar early, upset. And then I never saw those guys again. Then they used to go to the bar with every single weekend. I moved a couple months later. That was a really fun season. And then it was Brett Favre's final year with the Packers. And they went 13-3. And of course, it ended in heartbreaking fashion once again.
That was with the Giants, right?
Yeah, most seasons with the Packers, it always ends in heartbreaking fashion. It's typical Packer fans to have to experience. It's a Super Bowl year, but that was pretty fun. But it's always like some of the years when they're not supposed to be in the playoffs, and they just kind of like sneak in when they rail off like 7 wins. That's usually my favorite seasons because Rodgers just goes godlike, and he just throws insane stats and just throws insane passes and touchdowns, and it's just like that's when everybody goes back to, oh yeah, he's the best in the game. He's the best quarterback, maybe the most talented ever played. Maybe the most raw quarterback to ever play the game. When you watch those like 4 or 5 wins, he'll rail off. Like it was the year that the RELAX game, the relax season, when they lost in the NFC Championship game to the Seahawks too. They went 14-2 or whatever. That was another year where he just was godlike. And
I think that was his second MVP year.
Yeah, I think so too. He had like 40 touchdowns and like 5 interceptions in some obscene season. That was a really fun season to watch too.
Now, you had talked a little bit earlier about how the front office didn't really support Aaron the same way they didn't support Brett. And to me, it's interesting because when you look after that 2010 Super Bowl run, everybody thought that the Packers had all the makings of being the next dynasty. You know, they had an outstanding quarterback. They had a great defense. They had a great receiving core. You know, the offensive line gave up some sacks, but they did their job well enough to give Rodgers enough time to get the ball out. What is it that you think what would you say specifically the front office hasn't done to really give Rodgers that success that he had early on in the postseason?
You can narrow it down to one man named Ted Thompson, who was the GM. And you can go to Dom Capers too, but Dom Capers kept his job for so long. He was the defensive coordinator all those years. You can make it put him in the argument too, but he kept his job for so long because Ted Thompson was dumb. So Ted Thompson built himself. He's the GM, and he built himself up on like 2 things. It was retaining current players at all costs and drafting really good ones, like really young. But the problem is that throughout these years, he got worse and worse at drafting good players, and he got worse and worse at retaining good players. So like that year they won the Super Bowl, they lost Nick Collins and they lost Jermichael Finley that following year. And he was like one of the best tight ends in the league, and they went 15-1, but their defense got worse because they lost their all pro safety and they lost their best tight end. So, you know, they went 15-1 and they were really good, but there was beliefs within the Packer fandom that they weren't as good as they looked because they were in a weak division and they were playing like weak opponents, and they got into the playoffs, and of course Eli wrecked them. And then as the years went by, just more and more good players left. Like Greg Jennings left in a salty way. Greg Jennings wanting to resign. He was one of the best receivers in the NFL. They had the best receiving core that year they won the Super Bowl. They had Greg Jennings. They had who else? They had
Jordy Nelson.
Jordy Nelson when he was really young. They had
Donald Driver.
Jermichael Finley. They had a really good backup tight end as well. And every year
Corliss.
Well, yeah, Andrew Quarles, and then they had Randall Cobb. They drafted Randall Cobb the following year. So that following year, they had a really good receiving core as well. But then, like as the years went by, more and more players left because they weren't retaining them. So Greg Jennings wanted to stay. They didn't retain him. Jones wanted to stay. They didn't retain him. Donald Driver retired. Jermichael Finley got injured, never came back. And then the defense got wrecked too. The defense like all went off, and I think it wasn't Bubba Franks. It was he was the big dude. He was the defensive end. BJ Raji. He left.
The nose guard.
And then they just never drafted really anybody good. I mean, here and there they would draft a good player, but for the most part, they would just go over 10 on the NFL in the NFL draft. So it was just Rodgers, and they weren't signing anybody, and they did bring in somebody. It was somebody towards the end of their career. So they did well with Julius Peppers. I know they brought Julius Peppers in, and they got a lot out of him. But they brought in some other players, and they just weren't any good. And it was just like, it was so frustrating to watch. They brought in like Mercedes. They brought in Mercedes Lewis. He was somewhat good, but they brought in Martellus Bennett. He wasn't any good in that year. They brought in oh God, who was the tight end this past year? I can't think of his
Jimmy
name.
Graham.
They brought in Jimmy Graham. They didn't get anything out of him, and that was a Ted Thompson. That was a Ted Thompson move. So they just like, the team got worse and worse and worse. And then when they finally brought in Brian Gutekunst, they didn't realize how bad the team was, and how bad and how poorly they were, and how unathletic they were compared to some of these other teams like the Seahawks and the 49ers and some of these other teams that have gotten really good over the decade. Athleticism wise, they had no speed. They couldn't tackle on defense. They finally brought in a decent defensive coordinator. And now you're starting to see them kind of play in the offseason, actually bring in people that they need to. They brought in Zadarius Smith. They brought in Preston Smith. They drafted Aaron Jones. They didn't bring in a receiver, which is just absolutely frustrating. But now there's talk they might sign Everson Griffin from the Vikings. But what's going to happen is you're going to watch him like kind of flirt with them, and then he's going to go sign with the Seahawks, because that's usually what happens. It's always the Seahawks that pick up the players that I want the Packers to pick up. So Packers will flirt with them, and then they'll go sign with the Seahawks. And it's absolutely frustrating. They've done it a little bit under Gutekunst, but they're starting to revert back to Ted Thompson era decisions where we're good with what we got. And I'm like, no, you're not. You're not good with what you got, because you got wrecked in the NFC Championship on a superior team on all levels, and by a coach who coaches the exact same way as Matt LaFleur, just better. I mean, it's just, Shanahan's much better. Matt LaFleur, they're very close friends, and Matt LaFleur came up under Kyle Shanahan, but Kyle Shanahan is a much better coach than Matt LaFleur is. So I don't know.
Well, don't you think it's a little too early to make that claim though? Because I think Kyle is in his third or fourth year as a head coach, whereas Matt's in his first year. So there might be just some growing pains, especially going 13-3 your first year.
Yeah, but
I mean, I know a lot of people were skeptical if they were really as strong as that 13-3 record, but I still think, bar none, it was a good season for an inaugural head coach.
They overperformed, because there was a lot of games that they shouldn't have won that they just squeaked out, like the one against the Chiefs. But I think Kyle Shanahan, you can give him better praise, because the two times that he's coached Matt LaFleur, he's just crushed them. You can look at his days back in like Atlanta, and he was the year or two that he was there, the Falcons were really good, and then after he left, they weren't any good. And you see Matt LaFleur in Tennessee, and he's supposed to be a quarterback whisperer, and Mariota wasn't any good. The offense was bad. So I have faith, hopefully, in Rodgers and in the Packers, because I do think they have a good team. And I do think that, although like the one receiver that they signed, Devin Funchess, has opted out for the season, I do think that Aaron Jones and Devontae Adams are that good. And I think the three of them can carry the offense. And if they can get Emerson Griffin, they'll have the best line in football on the defensive side. They'll have Zadarius Smith, they'll have Clark, they'll have Emerson Griffin, they'll have Preston Smith, they'll have a decent linebacker core, and they'll have some really talented people on the outside. But they need to get Griffin, and they can't be like dancing around and like flirting with them. They need to actually sign him, because they're going to be dependent on their defense like crazy this year.
Now, when we're talking about the head coach usually is the one that's going to bear the brunt of the criticism whenever the team isn't doing well. And with Mike McCarthy, it seemed to go real bad real quick. But a lot of Packers fans will tell you it was something that was brewing for a long time. So as a fan, someone who followed that whole saga, can you kind of break down, I guess, what it was that really got this bad or got this out of hand? Was it something that really just kind of had popped up with Aaron and Mike McCarthy as a personality problem, or was it over scheme? What really was the circumstances surrounding it?
There was frustration with Mike McCarthy since like 2014. Since that year they lost to the Seahawks, it was his play. It was his play calls. It was the decisions that he made to play it safe on every single drive. Because you can look back at that game in 2014-15. There were certain drives they would get down to like the 1 yard line, and then they would stone on 3 plays in a row. And instead of like driving it in with Eddie Lacy one more time, they would kick a field goal. So what was an 18-0 lead should have been like a 26-0 lead or whatever. But it was his constant decision making, as like he was super conservative. Like when his first couple of years, he was this like innovative guy, but then he just never changed. The entire NFL moves past him, and he never changed, and he just stuck with this like really conservative play calling. And he went with this. The style was on offense with Mike McCarthy was he wasn't gonna draw up plays or create plays to get receivers open. He was gonna rely on the receivers to get opens on themselves. So there wasn't like any of these kind of really creative pick plays. There weren't these really creative plays that you now see with like the Patriots or the 49ers, or maybe what you see with, Kansas City, or not you just now see with the Packers. There wasn't any innovation. It was the same old. And because of Ted Thompson, because of our receivers were so outmatched as the years went on, and you had 1 or 2 good receivers, and Jordy Nelson was getting old. They weren't able to get separation like they used to. And so you're relying more and more on Aaron Rodgers. And because Aaron was so good, he masked some of the mistakes that Mike McCarthy might make. So there was growing frustration even amongst the fans with Mike McCarthy. So like, although he got fired in 2018, 2019, we were yelling for his dismissal in like 2015. So it was something that we had been wanting forever, and they finally had the guts to do it. And we were chanting for the firing of Don Capers since like 2012. Because he's just this dude. He was just like really old. He was another guy. He was another coach where the entire season passed him. Like the entire NFL passed him. And he used to be, once again, really innovative back in like the early 2000s. But he wasn't a good defensive coordinator, and the players were really flawed on defense too. I mean, you could count the missed tackles. I mean, it would be in the hundreds for the entire season. It was insane how many just like plays that would be like a 4-yard run with any other defense, and that 4-yard run would turn into like a 40-yard run when they were on defense. It was just frustrating as hell. So it was something that it wasn't just like one thing that ended it with Mike McCarthy and Aaron. It was just like, you could tell year on year out, like Aaron's like watching all these other quarterbacks and these innovative offenses tailored around him. And Aaron's like, what am I doing with this old offense? And like, my players are getting old, and they're not getting open, and I need help. And I think it was the year after 2014 when Jordy Nelson got hurt, when you really saw it for the first time, because Jordy Nelson was so good. And then you're stuck with like Randall Cobb and Devontae Adams, and this is like his second year and he wasn't good yet. And then you had all these like C-level receivers that couldn't get open. And that's when it started to brew a little bit.
Yeah, and going off the Dom Capers point, I remember, I think it was the game against the Buccaneers when they played in Lambeau in 2011 when LeGarrette Blount broke had to be about a 55-yard run, and he probably broke like 6 tackles on the way to the end zone. And you're watching this team, and you say, man, a year ago they had such a great defense, but this year they just weren't. They were getting turnovers, and they were getting sacks, but there was just something different. And I think a lot of it's – go ahead.
They were just a very flawed defense because they played off of those big plays. Because they led the NFL in interceptions the year prior, and that's why they were so good on defense, was because of those turnovers. But the second year, Capers' defense was never like a stout defense; it was just a really good playmaking defense, and then just got worse and worse at playmaking over the years.
Well, I think a lot of it too was like 2011 was the year when you had quarterbacks that were just going out of their mind with the passing game. I mean, we had 3 quarterbacks. I think Drew Brees, Matt Stafford, and Brady went over 5,000 yards passing. And I think that's when we had the lockout too. So you had defensive players that didn't really get, great practice time. Meanwhile, you get receivers that can able to practice with quarterbacks and run routes. So I think they just had like a leg up, and the rest of the NFL on defense was kind of left, looking for answers.
And I think that was the year that Matt Flynn threw the 5 touchdowns in the final game of the season for the Packers.
6 touchdowns. Yeah,
6 touchdowns, and he got that big contract with the Seahawks, and they never played a game.
That was weird.
They were 15-1, but they weren't. Their defense was a problem because they would blow team. They would score 50 points to win a game because the defense is scoring 30 points. So although they were scoring an obscene amount of points, they weren't defending, and that's probably why when they finally played a really good defense like the Giants uglied it up, and the Giants were able to squeak out a game like they did in 2008 against the Packers, and they did again in the Super Bowl. in both years. That actually that was really frustrating because I remember 2011, and I think they didn't meet in the NFC Championship game. It was the divisional round when they beat the Packers, but they beat them in the same way that they beat them in 2007 or 8 when Brett Favre was there, and then they went on to play the Patriots in the Super Bowl. And I remember in 2011, I was so frustrated with that Super Bowl because, and I told my dad or I told a friend, I'm like, I don't want this to be the same stupid game it was 5 years ago or whatever it was. And it was the same stupid game. It was ugly, and then it was Eli Manning throwing a stupid pass. And it was whoever that receiver was. I forgot who the receiver was for the
Mario Manningham.
That was it. It wasn't Victor Cruz. Mario
Manningham. The one that caught the Hail Mary at the end of the first half.
Yeah, and he caught it like on the outside, and he caught it like on the sideline, and then they did one in like last second, like they did. It was like the exact same game, and I'm like, oh my god, we just rewatched the same stupid Super Bowl we saw 4 years ago. For 4 years prior.
Okay, you're talking about the Super Bowl, yeah, where he had that insane catch right on the sideline. But that you got to admit that was a perfectly thrown ball. The first pass in the in Super Bowl 42, I think it was, whenever Rodney Harrison couldn't rip it from David Tyree, that was a pure luck pass, I think. But this pass was beautiful.
It was just salty. I was just salty because I just watched Eli Manning just have like the 2 best games of his life, and it was like that should have been Aaron Rodgers, and that should have been the Packers that year too. He took it from the Packers because the Packers should have been in the Super Bowl. They were the best team in the NFC that year when they played the Giants. And then the same time in 2011, they were the best team in the NFL, and they should have been in the Super Bowl, and they didn't get there because they got their heart broken. Like I know Patriots fans hate Eli Manning because he stole the Super Bowl away from them twice. He did the same thing to the Packers. He did the same thing to the Packers both years, and it was heartbreaking. And it was like that should have been at least one more Super Bowl for the Packers. But oh well.
Yeah, there are certain teams I feel like you just can't mention to Packers fans because, I mean, the Bears have never been a threat in the past 2 decades to them. Yeah. The Vikings, I mean, when Favre was there, it was something. And the Vikings have had some good seasons here and there, but I still don't think they can really crack the Rodgers case. But when it comes to the Giants, it seems to be the same repetitive formula to beating Rodgers. You keep him off the field, you make some big plays, and then you have your defense really take care of them on offense. And then you also bring in the 49ers and the Seahawks because there was a few years where Rodgers just couldn't, or I shouldn't say Rodgers. It was the entire Packers team that just couldn't get past Kaepernick. They couldn't get past Russell Wilson, and it was fun. It was fun to watch. It was definitely a one-man show at a certain point going up against like 2 excellent defenses. Yeah, but they just never really found a way to get over that.
It was those flawed Packers teams, and they were playing a mobile quarterback who they just couldn't tackle, and the defense just couldn't get a hold of them. They've had the Seahawks numbers the last 4 or 5 years. They've won like 4 or 5 games in a row against them, especially in the playoffs last year. But the Seahawks just signed the guy from the Jets, the safety, whatever his name is, Jamal Adams. Yeah, Jamal Adams. Yeah, that's going to be heartbreaking, and I not that he was ever going to go to the Packers, but it's just another example of the Seahawks going all out to try to get another Super Bowl and signing whoever they need to, or trading for whoever they need to. And I shouldn't focus that much on the Seahawks. Outside of one of my best friends is a Seahawks fan, so if something happens, like the Packers win, I just get a text. It's just, and I can hear him laughing in my ears, and it's just got like this shit-eating grin on his face. And every time the Seahawks do anything, I just get him in my head. And so I just like when they signed Jamal Adams, I remember seeing him the day before. We played golf together, and then they signed him. And the next day I just get a text with this GIF of this dude laughing his head off. And I'm like, well, there we go again.
As a Packer fan, who is your least favorite Packer of all time?
Ooh, that's tough. I guess coaches can't be included. Oh God, that's tough because most Packers have been really enjoyable to watch. There's some defensive players that I just absolutely couldn't stand. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. You know who the current one is? Is Blake Martinez. I cannot stand Blake Martinez. I don't even think he's with them anymore. He didn't sign a contract.
Linebacker.
Yeah, he absolutely drove me up a wall because his tackle numbers were always some of the best in the league, but he would always miss the initial tackle, and then he would like run back and tackle. So he'd always blow big plays, and he wasn't like he was the middle of the defense, and he was absolutely frustrating to watch. There was some other guys on the back end and the safeties that were just incredibly stupid, that were just like they would fuck up big plays. There was one of them, I don't know if it was last year, the year before. It was this one, I can't remember. It might have been this guy named Gunter. He would constantly just do stupid things, and he would constantly blow big plays. And he was always the one. I think he was the player that was trying to shadow. I'm really bad with players' names right now. Who's the guy for the not Roddy White? Who's the guy for the Falcons, the receiver?
Julio Jones.
Julio Jones. Yeah, it was the year that they played him in the NFC Championship game, and Julio Jones had like 200 yards, and this guy was the guy guarding him. It was either Butler or Gunter, and they were like third string cornerbacks because all the other players got hurt, and they were put on Julio Jones, and it was just an atrocity. And it was just
that was the game. That was the game after they beat the Cowboys, wasn't it, in the divisional round?
Yeah. It was when Aaron threw that crazy pass, and Mason Crosby just kind of hit this kind of like flop of a field goal to make a pass, and we just kind of this crazy game that they won that they shouldn't have. And then they played just a much superior team, and then against the Falcons, and they just got destroyed. That was such a bad year.
So what about players who were underrated during the real heyday of the Packers? Who do you think really didn't get the recognition they deserved?
I will say it to my dying breath that Randall Cobb is still very underrated, because Randall Cobb was so great and he was so much fun to watch. I mean, one of his first plays was with the Packers. He ran a 110-yard return back for a touchdown against.
That was the opening night against the Saints, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I always thought he was extremely underrated. There was a guy named Richard Rodgers, who was the tight end for a couple of years, and he was the one.
Yeah, he caught the Lions Hail Mary.
Yeah. He was always. He just had these glue of hands, and he wasn't that fast. He wasn't that big, but he would just catch everything Aaron threw at him. And he was the one that caught that weird pass on the sideline, I think, against the Cowboys. I think he's the one that caught that ball. Might have been someone else, but I'm pretty sure it was him. But he had these glue of hands. So he was really good. And there's a couple of Donald Driver was always really underrated. Ryan Grant was always really underrated. They had some running backs that were just really underrated. Amon Green was really underrated. But Randall Cobb was my favorite player the last 10 years because I followed him at Kentucky too. And in Kentucky, he played like 4 different positions because they were just really bad. And so they needed one guy to play like quarterback and running back and receiver and defensive back and return. So he did that. And then we got in the NFL, he was kind of the same thing. He was just kind of like this like multi-versatile player that just kind of did everything. And he just didn't get a lot of praise because I thought he was one of the best receivers in the NFL, at least in the slot, and no one ever talked about him. But he was always really good, and he was always really fast.
Now, we've kind of touched on the best memories you have. Now, in terms of specific games, what are some of the best games you remember and some of the most frustrating games that you remember?
One of the most frustrating games was the year before they won the Super Bowl. They were playing the Cardinals in the playoffs, and there was this play at the very end of the game. Packers, it was back and forth. It was like really high scoring game, and Kurt Warner was still. I think it was the year that Kurt Warner and the Cardinals made it to the Super Bowl, and they lost to the Steelers.
No, it was the year after.
Oh, okay.
That was the season whenever he got knocked out of the divisional round when they played the Saints.
Okay, that's right. Yeah. So they played a game against the Packers in the playoffs. It might have been a wild card. And Rodgers was really young. It was his 3rd or 4th year. And there was a play at the end of it where they were trying to drive down the field and tie it or take the lead. And Rodgers got sacked, but he also got his head like ripped off on the helmet by one of the linemen. And they didn't call pass interference, and it was the most blazing. Like, I know that the one with the Saints and the Rams like 2 years ago was pretty blatant. Like the pass interference was pretty blatant. This one was bad. And I guess they said like he was tackled first and then he had his head ripped off. But I'm like, it's still face mask. It's still like one of the worst face masks I've ever seen in my life. And he fumbled it, and the Cardinals picked it up and scored, and that was a game. That was incredibly frustrating. Another frustrating one was the Seahawks. There's some other ones that they just got absolutely just destroyed, and it was just really frustrating to watch. Any of those NFC Championship games where whether it was last year against the 49ers or whether it was against the Falcons, those were incredibly frustrating. Some of the best ones, any of those on that year they won the Super Bowl in 2011, those games were just a
2010.
blast. 2010, that was it, yeah. that year was always a blast because they had a lot of injuries and they won like in the final game of the season, and then they beat the Eagles, crushed the Bears, they crushed the Falcons. They took down the three best teams in the conference to go into the Super Bowl, and the games weren't close. Like the games, I think one of them was kind of close. I think the Falcons game was closer.
But well, the Falcons game, they completely destroyed the Falcons, and I think the Eagles game was okay. It was kind of close. I mean, I think the Eagles had a chance to win at the end, but then the Bears was a close game, but I don't think the game was as close.
It never felt close.
Yeah.
Because they got out to these massive leads, and Rodgers was at his peak, and then they played the Steelers, and they just fucking tore the Steelers to shreds, and that was great. I mean, granted, the game was better than but they went up like 14-0 early on the game because they had that pick six early on.
Nick Collins. Yeah.
So like Jordy just couldn't catch a ball that game, but that was a really fun season. Like I said, some of the games from the RELAX season, the relaxed season, some from the run the table season, and then this past year was a really fun team. There were some really good guys to root for. Like Zadarius Smith is a really fun guy to root for. Preston Smith was a really good guy to root for. Darnell Savage was really fun to root for. It was the first time that we finally had a defense that were like, ooh, this is fun. This is what it's like to sack a quarterback. This is what it's like to get an interception. And then the offense, like Aaron Jones, is just so much fun to watch. He's this tiny little dude. He just can just shred you. And he's quick. He's quick. He's kind of sneaky quick because you don't look at him and you're like, that guy's really fast. No, he just gets out in the open field and he's like really shifty and he just can make a lot of big plays happen.
Yeah, watching that Kansas City game this year, Patrick Mahomes was out, but that was such an exciting game. I think it was probably the best game of the year, at least in the regular season for me.
Who was it? Matt something? Who was the quarterback, the backup they signed off the street? Matt something. Oh God, Matt played for the. He used to play for the. He used to be a backup for the Panthers for a long time. He's got a really generic name. I can't think of his name.
He was out. He was out for a little while, but his name is escaping me.
He was a high school coach too. He was coaching high school. Yeah. I'm gonna look at Matt. I'm just gonna look at Packers Chiefs 2019. His name will pop up because now it's just driving me up a wall, and I'm not gonna be able to remember it. I'm not gonna be able to focus on 1 second.
He played for the Dolphins too.
Yeah. He was just like a kind of a career backup. Box score. Matt Moore. There we go. Matt Moore. He threw for 267 yards and two touchdowns that game. Rodgers threw for 303 touchdowns. He was incredibly frustrating to watch because he just he shouldn't have. But that you give a mediocre quarterback that kind of fucking receiving core. Sorry for part of my French, but you give him all those receivers and all those weapons. Maybe we should start questioning how good Patrick Mahomes is. Because he's got all those great weapons like Tyreek Hill and Damian Williams and Travis Kelce. Give anybody those. You give Jay Cutler those players, and Jay Cutler is probably not as bad as he usually is.
Yeah, but give any of those players Patrick Mahomes, and it could be a different story, right?
He's going to throw over 50 touchdowns in the season and win the Super Bowl in the second year, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really crazy. I mean, he's become really the face of the NFL, and rightfully so. He's a magnificent player, and really, it's been a while since we've had a guy like him that really came in and just completely dominated from the moment he stepped onto the field.
Yeah,
because I don't. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, what's the first thing you buy when you get that contract extension like you got?
We bought champagne.
just buy. I've been watching a lot of the Grand Tour, which is a car show, and there's a lot of cars that probably buy off that show. Some $200,000 Bentleys I would buy.
And it's a very incentive heavy contract. I mean, $503 million. Obviously, it's a great deal, but I think. I'm not sure how much of that is guaranteed. I want to say
salary cap, isn't it?
Well, 141 million is guaranteed, and 63 of that I think he got when he signed.
Yeah.
But I mean, no one has any reason to believe he won't meet the other incentives. But
yeah, and I think he gets. I think part of it was tied to the salary cap. As the salary cap increases over the years, I think he gets some kind of percentage off of it. It increases it increases like X amount of dollars for every dollar. The salary cap increases.
Now, in terms of non-Packer memories, what is something that like growing up watching football that you really miss or that really stood out to you?
Man, it's all tied around the Packers.
Well, you mentioned that you were an Eddie George fan, right?
Yeah, but I don't really remember much of him. I just remember I had a jersey of his. I really liked him in Madden. That was like my biggest memory of him. But actually, you know what? You know, it was a really. This doesn't sound bad. I root for the Patriots a little bit because I live there and I don't have the hatred for them as most people do, because I kind of respect them, and I do respect the way that the Patriots fans troll people. So in 2016, I think it was, when they beat the Falcons in that Super Bowl, they came back 28-3. That was a really fun game because it was a really fun Super Bowl party we had at our apartment, and because I got horribly drunk. But at the same time, I remember like the next day or the following week, we got this massive snowstorm in Boston, and I was at work, and they're doing the parade, and somebody in Boston Commons, which is like the big park in the snow, wrote "F.U. Goodell" in the snow. And the helicopter was like flying over at the wrong time and caught it with this overhead footage. And they showed it on the local news, so we were at work and saw it, and then they realized what it was, and they quickly panned off of it. And then during the Boston Marathon that spring, all these people lined up on the side of the road during the route, and they had all these signs that showed 28-3, and they were running by, and it was just like, hey, if the Patriots can do it, you can too. So that was very funny. And then Dave Portnoy did something very funny the following year when they finally got Goodell to come. I think it was after they beat the Rams. They finally got Goodell to come to Foxborough. It might have been 2016. It was after one of those two Super Bowls that they won. They finally got Goodell to come to Foxborough after the whole debacle with Deflategate. And Dave Portnoy had these like logos, or these like, he had these T-shirts made up like the year prior after Deflategate happened with Roger Goodell's face on it with like the clown nose, and they're like big sellers on Barstool. And so he had like 30,000 rally towels made up, and he passed them out to everybody at the game that Roger Goodell was at. So everybody was waving them. And they actually got a picture of Roger Goodell waving the towel with his face on it, with the clown makeup on him. And then at the same time, he found out what hotel Roger Goodell was staying at, and every billboard in between that hotel and the stadium, he bought up, and he put up wanted signs, like FBI's most wanted, Roger Goodell, and here's this crimes against the Patriots that he committed, and it showed like all the shit that he did and all the suspensions, and like the fines and everything. So it was like this wanted poster with just Roger Goodell's face on it, and he had to see him as he went into the stadium. So there's stuff like that were pretty fun, that were like Unpacker related, that are like football adjacent, or like revolving around the Patriots, that were very funny. And it was kind of fun to root for the Patriots that year in that Super Bowl.
Did you ever go to a game at Gillette?
No, you're too expensive, stupidly expensive, like $300. It was just dumb. Like I have a friend whose husband plays with the Patriots right now. He literally just opted out. And I was joking with her because he opted out. Matt Lacrosse.
Oh, the tight end.
Yeah. So I texted Jesse because I went to college with her, and she's actually pregnant. They're about to have a baby in November, and that's why he opted out. But I texted her. I'm like, is it fixed in? Is this it? Is this what they're doing? Like, just let me know. You're my only inside source. Of the Patriots tanking for Trevor? And she goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. It's just kind of fun. She's like, I have no idea what any of that means, because she was in Chicago, I think. And I think her husband is in Massachusetts for training camp or whatever. And she was just like, Matt's not here to decode what you just said. But he's a very nice guy. I think I met him once.
Well, with Cam Newton going to New England, there's a little bit of a resurgence, it seems.
Well, we'll see. I actually like Cam, and I hope he does well, and I hope that he earns every incentive part of that contract. And I hope that he is able to prove that he's good. But at the same time, it'd be nice to have just the Patriots not be good for a year, just selfishly. Although I do root for him a little bit, I kind of like Tom and Tom Brady, and I would like to see him be better. And just because the argument who's better, who's the reason for the greatness, Belichick or Tom? I'm kind of lead towards Tom. I'd like to see him make the Buccaneers really good, and just see the Patriots kind of like. It'd actually be kind of funny to see the Patriots tank for Trevor, from the quarterback from Clemson. It'd be kind of nice to see him do that. It'd be kind of funny. But I'd like to see Tom Brady do really well.
See, it's funny you mentioned that, because on the last podcast I did, my guest and I were talking about kind of the dynamic between Belichick and Brady, where, typically the Belichick will get more of the benefit of the doubt in terms that he could do well without Brady, but Brady doesn't necessarily get that same leeway. that they give to Bill. Oftentimes it's saying, "Hey, Tom wouldn't be this great without Bill," but you don't really hear it the other way.
Well, it's like, because you've seen a little bit of Belichick without Tom. You've never seen Tom without Belichick, and I think that's the biggest issue is because there's very little evidence to show that Belichick without him, and that's really the season that Matt Castle was quarterback and they made it to the playoffs, and then like the first 3 or 4 games of that year he was suspended, and Garoppolo looked like an all-pro. But that's it. That's all the evidence that you have, and it's not really much to go off of, but it's more than watching Tom without him. And I think you're going to see a little bit of it. Granted, he's got a really good coach, and he's got a very quarterback-friendly coach in Tampa that he's going to be playing for. That'll be interesting. I think it's going to help him. And the Patriots, I mean, their entire team is basically sitting out this year. I mean, all their players, all their good ones, are just taking the year off, and I don't blame them. I mean, it's going to be a weird season. I mean, if you're loaded and you're worth that amount of money, why do you even play? I mean, why risk it?
Yeah, there's a lot to figure out. But you mentioned earlier about Madden, because I know you must have been playing some Madden to pass the time, yeah?
Not actually, no. I hadn't played any Madden at all during COVID. I hadn't played a lot of Madden since like college.
What was your favorite Madden game?
It was the one with Sean Alexander on it. It was the last one they made for the original Xbox. Oh no, yes, yeah. It was the one with Sean Alexander on it. The year after they played the Steelers in the Super Bowl, and he had just broken the record for most touchdowns in the season. It was the year that LT then broke his record for the most touchdowns in the season by a running back. And that was my favorite Madden. I was the last one I religiously played. I got really into college football. The college football video games for EA. I got really into those in college. But yeah, I never really got into Madden. I think probably the last time I played Madden was probably against you over at that video game place over that esports place over in the east side Beltline.
Yeah,
Axis Replay or whatever it was.
And I don't have any of the newer Madden games. So typically when I'm playing is basically Madden 12, Madden 13. And, I was never what is it called? Like a franchise mode player. I was always just play the exhibition games. But, you feel like a certain nostalgia just like listening to that old music on the soundtrack and just like seeing like a lot of players that you kind of forgot about in a way, So it's cool to really go back and revisit and to play those games because Madden, when I was growing up, because I don't think I owned my first Madden game until probably Madden 09 or Madden 10 maybe. And I would always go to my neighbor's house and play it. But just watching how the graphics have kind of evolved to where they are now, it's nuts. Because I even have the reissue Super Nintendo that they put out a couple of years ago, where they have all the games in instead of having to put the cassette in. And you're playing like Madden 94, and you're just seeing like this like block of pixels just running up, and it's so slow, and it's just terrible. I don't know how anybody would have the patience to play it.
I think the one football game I think I told you about it when we went to that place over in over by that dive bar you really like over in on
the Beltline.
No, it's over by Piedmont Park. What's that one that you like?
Oh, Smith's Old Bar.
Smith's Old Bar, yeah. It was that weird old retro place that was next door.
Yeah.
That we went to.
Yeah, Dead Tech.
Yeah, there was a video game there that I think I noticed. It's called NFL Club Quarterback 98. That was the first football game I ever had. It was with Brett Favre on the cover of it. And the graphics were so bad or so old that they didn't have the distinct faces of the players. It was just like a smiley face. And there was one player that was unstoppable in that game, and that was Terrell Davis. And you could it was like Bo Jackson Tecmo Bowl. You just had to like stiff arm people, and you couldn't tackle them. You would just rattle off like 98-yard touchdowns. And then the next football game I had was Madden 03 with Marshall Faulk on the cover of it. That was a really fun game. That was my first Xbox. That was a really fun game. And then the next Madden I think I had was like 05, and then I had the 07 or 08 one, which had Sean Alexander on it, and then I got 360, and then I never had a Madden game again. I bought the NCAA football games pretty religiously, and the last one I was really into was the last one they made, which was 14, and that was a really fun game.
Yeah, and I enjoyed those games too, and I enjoyed that because they had like a lot of more crazy formations in that game.
Yeah.
They would have like, because obviously in Madden they would have the Wildcat and stuff like that, but when you're talking about college football where they have over 120 teams to choose from a playbook in the NCAA games, you just had some of the craziest stuff you could find in there.
Yeah, and we used to do in NCAA 14, we used to do this massive online franchise mode with like there's 13 or 14 of us. Like most of them were at my university, but there was a couple in like Chattanooga, I think. And we
Mhm.
all picked teams and we would just play. We just played seasons, and it was so much fun. I think the first team I was Northwestern, and then I think I switched to Texas, and that was my dynasty. And I was we would play it on like the highest mode possible, like the hardest mode possible. And every time I played an actual person, I would get destroyed. But I would only schedule like one actual person a season, so I would go like 11-1, and then I get into like a really good bowl game, and then just get wrecked by whoever actual person, like one of my friends would actually play me. But we would play on the hardest mode, and I figured out a couple of glitches where you'd only have to run like 3 or 4 plays. You'd run like a read option, you'd run like a sweep play, and then there was a pass play where you'd have one receiver on the right. I think it was like the farthest receiver run just a complete out or just a go route, and then you'd have like the slot receiver, the tight end, run like an out route. And so he would run like 10 yards and out, and then you'd have like the one guy going all out, going on a street play, and so that safety wouldn't know what to do. So though sometimes he would come up and guard like the guy running the out route, and then you had the outside receiver just completely open because they're all three cornerbacks, so the two cornerbacks and the safety would just get jumbled up. Because sometimes the formations where there was no cornerback to cover the inside receiver, the slot receiver, the tight end, so you'd have the safety come in, and then sometimes the outside cornerback would shift to the inside guy, and so you had a guy going crazy, or that guy the safety would then go over to the guy running the streak, so you had a guy wide open running 10 yards and out, and you could just throw an easy pass to him. And then I'd run like 3 run plays, I mean 2 run plays up the middle and one read option, and then that one little pass play, and I would just do that consistently. And I think my running back won the Heisman that year, but it was just so stupid. And then I play a real person and just get absolutely wrecked by 50 points. That was probably the last video game, like football video game, I really got into, because there hasn't been a new one since. I've just been like, oh yeah, I really want to play it.
Now, do you enjoy watching the college game more than you enjoy watching the pro game?
Depends. I I'd rather watch a generic college game that I have no rooting interest in more so than an NFL game. So like if the Packers aren't playing, unless it's like a big game, unless it's like a legitimately big Sunday night football game, like if it's like the Seahawks and like the 49ers, I'd probably watch it. But I'd rather watch just a random ass college football game than just a random football NFL game.
Why?
I think it's more entertaining. I think it depends. I like more college teams just because there's a more variety of them than I do NFL teams. It's like I like the Packers. That's my team. I have a vast hatred for a lot of NFL teams. And then there's like one or two that I kind of enjoy. Like if the Chiefs are on, I'm going to watch them. The Patriots are on, pre this year, I'd probably watch it. But there's like 6 or 7 college teams that I could sit down and watch. And plus, there's just so many games that you can flip from like an Alabama LSU game to an Ohio State Michigan game to a Kentucky Vanderbilt game or whatever. There's just so many more games on Saturdays than there are on Sundays. So I look more forward to a Packer game than any college game I can think of. But as far as just any team that I don't have a rooting interest in, I'd rather watch just a basic college football game over an NFL game because the crowds are better. They're usually more fun to watch. They're usually doing something crazy. So I just have more interest in college in that realm.
Yeah. See, where I went to school, I went to the University of South Florida, and it was a little similar situation to what you were in, where we were a D1 program, and I think my junior year was probably our best year, but we never really had the crazy atmosphere that you would see at these SEC games. And whenever I moved to Atlanta, because I grew up about 45 minutes away from UF, but I didn't really get much of an interest in football until I was probably in 7th or 8th grade, and I was following the NFL. But coming to Atlanta, you just see an enclave or a variety of different fans. It's like you got Alabama fans, you got Georgia fans, you find some Ole Miss fans in there. So really college football, when you're in the South, especially in like Georgia, you're going to have to take some sort of an interest to it because it's all over the place.
Yeah, it's just, yeah. It also depends on where you're in the country, because when I lived in Boston, no one gave a crap about college football because the only real teams up there are Syracuse and Boston College, and neither are good. And Boston College hadn't been good in decades. Like I remember there was a year I lived there. Lamar Jackson was playing at Louisville,
Mm-hmm.
and you could go to the Boston College Louisville game for like $5. and you can watch the Heisman Trophy winner just absolutely destroy him, and there was no one in the game. There's just no one because they didn't care. And it was like you got a chance to see the future MVP of the NFL play in the former Heisman Trophy winner. So it's just different up there. So, but down in the Southeast, I mean, college football is king, especially in Atlanta. I mean, more people care about UGA than the Falcons. And in North Carolina, your fandom is you're split up between 3 or 4 schools in North Carolina. It's like North Carolina, NC State, Clemson, and South Carolina are really the 4 schools that really matter. You get some transplants, but it's mostly those 4 schools. So it really just depends on where you are in the country.
Yeah, when it comes to the actual game, I look at the college game and I see a lot of stuff I like in terms of the crazier trick plays that you don't normally see in the NFL. But I do think the gap is kind of closing between the styles of play, because when you look at the wide hash marks in college football, you'll see a lot more space and a lot more. You have a lot less selection, I guess, of plays that are being run. But you see a lot more big plays because I think it's more about athleticism and speed than it is purely about design. But it seems like the NFL is kind of incorporating more of a college playbook towards the athletes they have now. So it's interesting to see how that transition is happening.
Well, I think they realize that they've been trying to convert these mobile quarterbacks coming out of college who were great in college, and they're like, all right, we're gonna make you conform to an NFL system. And I think now they're starting to realize that's probably not the best thing to do. Let's build a system around this guy and his talents, because they're trying to make a guy with these crazy talents conform to a stationary quarterback system. Like they're trying to convert Lamar Jackson into Tom Brady. It's not going to happen. You got to make Lamar Jackson play Lamar Jackson, and forever how long you get out of him if he gets hurt, that sucks. But you're gonna that's it for right now. Like that's his number one skill is running, and he's good at throwing. I mean, those are really beautiful long ball, but he's got to work on some of those other things. Same with, they built the system basically around Patrick Mahomes, and it's the best thing you can do instead of just making it conform to whatever system that you had your mind preset on.
Yeah, when you watch mobile quarterbacks, especially in the decade that we were growing up in, I think really, you had certain plays designed for them. Like you would spread everybody out and run a quarterback draw, or you would have a bootleg run, or if anything, they would have the freedom where if they were playing man coverage and everybody was downfield, you would take off because the defender had their back to them. So it's really, it's nice to see in terms of the diversity of the NFL's playing styles. You get kind of in a world where you can see someone who is a traditional drop back quarterback go up against the new school running option style quarterback. So I'm really excited to see how far that can go into the future.
Yeah. We see after now that we've seen Lamar, we've seen Patrick Mahomes, and we've seen some of these other young quarterbacks for the last 2 years. It'll be interesting to see how offenses kind of can conform to them, and how the defenses start to pick up on things that they're good at and start to defend them, because Patrick Mahomes is really good, but he's not going to have 50 touchdown seasons every single season. He was worse this year than he was last year, and it's not that much. He wasn't that much worse, but he was worse. If you take out the injuries, injury aside, he was worse. He just not that much. Like I said, not that much worse. He won a Super Bowl, but he wasn't as good as he was in his first year, because teams are like, okay, we've seen him. We've got some things we can expect from him. Now we know how to somewhat plan.
Yeah, and when you have a whole season's worth of tape on a guy, you're going to see defenses play to his weaknesses, the very few weaknesses that he has. But it's going to be interesting to see further down the road how teams will continue to adapt, because like we were talking about earlier, he does have a great team around him. So depending on how long they can keep those guys together will be interesting to see if that offense can be slowed down, if at all. But nonetheless, the kind of style of football that we're seeing now, I think, is really just going to continue to expand and expand.
Yeah. It'll be there's so much more great talent that's coming out of college that you're going to see more systems create, more creative systems that people are bringing. And plus there's, once Lincoln Riley finally leaves Oklahoma, I think he's the hottest name in college football right now, because he coached Baker and he coached Kyler Murray. That's another guy to watch, is Kyler Murray. He's going to be really good this year. But to see him finally get in the NFL, because at some point he's going to leave college, even though he's got the perfect setup, it'll be really fascinating to watch how he coaches in the NFL. Because right now, with the most innovative minds are Kyle Shanahan and what's the guy of the Rams? I'm like I said, I'm really bad with
Sean McVay.
Sean McVay, and some of these other guys. It'll be interesting to see if Lincoln Riley finally comes into the NFL and kind of upends what they're doing, because he's his offenses are just insane right now.
Now, have you seen a lot of Jordan Love?
No,
Not at all.
not at all. I'm so salty that I'm not even going to look him up. I just saw the replays that on the draft night. I just saw the stuff they were playing. His highlight package after they announced the pick. I hear that he's got like they see him as like the next Patrick Mahomes, which I'm like, why?
Who says that?
That's what the draft night announcers were saying, that like he has like all the skills that Patrick Mahomes might have, but he's got much more downside, and his upside is not nearly as good as Patrick Mahomes. So the Packers, I think, were thinking, oh, okay, this is our guy. He's mobile and he's got a big arm. That's like his thing. And I'm like, well, that's not something to go off of, because there's plenty of quarterbacks that have come in the NFL with big arms and they haven't done anything. For me, I think a lot of it is the kind of system and the kind of setup that these players are in when they come in, because you could probably draw a direct line between successful quarterbacks coming out of college and what systems they were set up in, because some of them, there's probably a lot of really good quarterbacks that kind of came in and they just were put into really bad teams and they just couldn't succeed. You got to put these young quarterbacks in position to succeed. That's where like why Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, partially why they're so good is because they have such good coaches, and they're with such good franchises, and they came into really good situations. That's why Jimmy Garoppolo succeeded as much as he did when he was in New England, because he was in a really good situation, and then he went into another really good situation. And you'll see it with other quarterbacks. So Aaron Rodgers was so good. He came into a really good franchise behind a great quarterback, and he had 2 or 3 years to sit. And he came out and he had those years to develop, and he wasn't ready right away. I'm hoping that's what happens with Jordan Love, because I think what you're going to see with the Packers and the way Aaron Rodgers' contract is set up, there's no reason to get rid of him in the next 2 years. But in like 3 or 4 years, something happens with his contract where you can get rid of him. You can cut him, and there's not as much of a financial burden. And now with COVID, and if it hurts the season at all, that's one less year that we have with Aaron. And it's just like, oh, great. That's one more year closer to freaking Jordan Love. And they're going to figure out a way to get rid of him. They're going to figure out a way to cut Aaron in 2 or 3 years, and then he's going to end up on the Rams.
Why do you say the Rams?
Because he's from California and he's got a place in LA. I can just see him. He's a California kid, so there's been talk that he might go to Chicago, and I'm like, no. Why would he go to Chicago? That makes no sense. But I can see him ending up on the Rams or the Chargers or whoever else. Maybe the 49ers. Maybe he goes back because he's from San Francisco.
Goes to his childhood team.
Yeah, he goes back to the team that should have drafted him in the first place. So I think he ends up somewhere out west in a couple of years. Is like a Peyton Manning kind of thing where he's got 2 or 3 years left in him. And I think he wins another Super Bowl, but it's just not with the Packers. It's gonna be with another team, and it's gonna break my heart.
Yeah, that'll rip your heart out real quick.
Yep, and it's just like the audacity and the pride that Brian Gutekunst and Matt LaFleur think they have, that they think they have all this power and this credibility now that they're just gonna go like the shit that they did. Like it's just, I could go off on that draft night, but I'm trying not to anger myself. Trying not to piss myself off.
Yeah, it seems like you've lost some serious sleep over it.
It was just like, you guys went 13-3. Cool. But where do you guys get off saying that you now have like all this authority to where you guys don't think you need Aaron Rodgers anymore and you guys can just go ahead and pick his backup? Like, no. Like, that's not how it works. Maybe in like 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 good years, maybe you guys have some draft stock. You guys have some stock where you guys can go spend it. But like the idea that you had 1 year that was good and you guys overaccomplished, and now you're not going to do anything to really benefit your team in the short term and you're going to play for the long term, make any sense? It just didn't make any sense to me. But, oh well, I'm not an NFL GM, so I wouldn't know.
Well, it's a hard job, man. I mean, not a lot of people ever know a GM's name, but it's a job that keeps getting more difficult every year because the amount of responsibilities and the amount of time that you have to spend really keeping up with the business, but also keeping up with trends in terms of where the game is going just continues to add to your workload.
Yeah. And
because I think a lot of people when they play fantasy football, they think, oh, I could do this full time. Well, it's a lot different.
Yeah, it's definitely not something you can do for sure. You can do for real, but yeah.
All right, man. Well, before we close off, I just want to ask one more question. Now, however big or small, can you just talk to us about the impact that football has had in your life and why you think everybody should give it a shot at some point?
Playing or watching?
Both.
Both. Well, the 1 year it really humbles you. So if you want to play and you're kind of like up on your, if you think you're good playing in a park because you think you're fast, because I was good playing with friends in a park, and yeah, you're not as good as you think. And so when you go play like for like a legit high school football team, you're gonna get your butt kicked. But as far as a fandom, I don't know. For me, it's like something that's run in my family as far as like being a Packer fan. I didn't grow up in a family that grew up around playing high school football or anything. Like I've got friends from Texas where, it's like Friday Night Lights. High school football is religion out there. I grew up in a very Packer focused family outside of my dad's side. Um, and it's just something that like I could talk to my grandfather about. And as crazy as our family is, like, right, so everything going on in politics right now and everything going on in the country and COVID and everything like that, there's always everybody's got that crazy uncle. Everybody's got, everybody around the Thanksgiving dinner table, there's going to be screaming at each other. But the one thing that will like keep the family sane, and you can always switch the topic off of politics or whatever. You can always switch it back to Packer football, or at least or Badger football with our family. So like even going into like this Thanksgiving, I think it's going to be a crazy Thanksgiving for everyone because you're going to have a Thanksgiving 3 weeks after an election that's extremely divisive, um, depending on where COVID is in that time of the year. But I know from my dad's side of the family, we're all big Kentucky fans. So and I know like three or four of my aunts and uncles that are incredibly conservative. So I know that like there's going to be screaming at each other regardless of who wins the election in November. But the one thing that we can always come back to is Kentucky basketball. So it's the same with my parent mom's side. The one thing that always brings us back to loving each other is Packer football. And it's always like if you are in Wisconsin, everyone's gonna be nice to you, and especially if you're a Packer fan. And even if like and another thing is like no matter where I've lived over the last 3 or 4 years, because I've moved 4 times in 5 years, the one thing that I can always find like a little bit of community in is finding me a local Packer bar. And that was like the one thing, like when I first moved to Boston, it was the one thing that made me sane when I first moved there, because it's a completely different world compared to Charlotte, North Carolina. The one thing that made me sane was going to the Packer bar every single Sunday. And then when I moved here, there was 2 Packer bars that I went to every other Sunday or whatever it was. I would rotate them. Unfortunately, one of them closed down. TJ's in Alpharetta closed down, which is really sad. It was a really fun bar, even though it was like a smoking bar. But it was always one thing that always brought me back to like a little bit of community wherever I lived, was finding that local Packer bar, because everybody is so nice. All the food is tailored to Packer people. It's all cheese related or brats or chili. And everybody is just like, it's a sense of family. It's a sense of community, and it's really nice. So that's like the biggest thing that I think with people is that when you find a team to root for, it's like when people find an English Premier League team that they root for. It's a sense of relation, and with how divisive things are right now, there was a poll that came out that said that this country is more polarized now than it's ever been since the Civil War, which is kind of nuts. The one thing that I think is going to bring people back to kind of some kind of like optimism with COVID and everything going on is sports being back, and I think we needed it, because with COVID happening, there was nothing else to talk about but COVID. Everything had stopped. Movies had stopped. Sports had stopped. TV had stopped. The only thing that we could talk about was COVID. Now the sports back, it really does make you happy again. And I think it's the same. It just normally with football, if you can get somebody to pick a team, if you've never been around football before, you can find a team with a really good fan base, and you can find your local bar, whether it's a Cowboy bar, Packer bar, Patriot bar. You can build relationships with people that you may not have before, and it's kind of cool. So that'd be the biggest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even when I moved to Atlanta and I found Smith's, which is a Steeler bar, you really kind of get like a good sense of community with people who just are in the same rooting interest. It's like you almost believe for a minute that you're in the city of that town where the team is located. So It's always good to really find something to get that local community vibe.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like whatever's going on in the world, you can escape for a couple hours and go to your local team bar and just be around people that you have one thing in common. Like, no matter where they're from, you have one thing in common. That's your Packer fan, or that's your whatever team it is. So,
yeah, man. It's I hope we get it, but the future will take care of itself. All right,
We'll,
everybody. Before
we'll
we
get,
go ahead.
no, I was just say we'll get it. I think we'll have somewhat of a season. It's just going to be a weird season.
Yeah, fingers crossed. All right, everybody, before we log off, just want to remind you to go to thefootballodyssey.com for curated articles about a variety of football topics. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at The Football Odyssey. All right, Ben, it was a pleasure to have you on. Hopefully we can have a season upcoming. That way we can get together and watch some games. But until then, man, stay safe.
You too, buddy.
All right, Ben.
Yeah.